Welcome everybody to China Unbound and in the camps. Sort of warming up a little bit right now because I want to make sure that our attendees on Zoom can hear. So if I could get somebody on Zoom to let me know in the chat. All right, testing one more time. Can you hear me out there in the Zoom? Yes. Nice to see everybody, as I was saying. And I really appreciate the Zoom people. I actually have it right in front of me. I can see if you can hear, when you can hear me and when you can't hear me. I don't know why I was suddenly muted. It's one of those mysteries of hybrid events, but my name is Jeremy Brown, chair of the history department at Simon Fraser University. Very happy to co-host this event. Very happy to see audience members still coming into this event in person. Welcome, right on time, find a seat. History at SFU is co-hosting with the David Lamb Center for International Communication and with the School of International Studies, which is providing us with this wonderful high-tech venue that allows us to do a hybrid event. And so super grateful for their support. Super grateful to Kaylin Barrett and to Doris Tai, who are working behind the scenes to make sure this goes smoothly. So let me start now by respectfully acknowledging that those of us in the room here at SFU Vancouver are situated on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I urge those of you on Zoom to think about where you're sitting. Where are you right now? Think about what Indigenous territory, and think about the Indigenous past, present, and future of that territory that you're sitting on right now. And so I'm chair of the history department. It's not really enough for the chair of the history department at Canada's #1 comprehensive university to do a territorial acknowledgement. I don't think that's sufficient. I think that history departments and universities in Canada actually have a responsibility to do more, right? University history departments are responsible for teaching students to consider the past in an accurate and honest way. And there's one obstacle in the way of us doing that, and that's actually the colonial nature of the discipline of history and the colonial structure of the university. So I'm really excited to go beyond that territorial acknowledgement and announce to you that the SFU History Department is embarking on a long-term process of decolonization. And that means looking at our course names, looking at our course titles, looking at our structure. And that also means taking part in events like this tonight, where we're going to be talking about something disturbing and traumatic. We're going to be talking about cultural genocide being carried out by a colonial government in the present. And so we're going to be talking about the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to carry out a cultural genocide. And some scholars, including one who is actually employed by this university, have argued in print that because Canada is complicit in its own cultural genocide and attempted to wipe out Indigenous cultures and languages in residential schools, some scholars argue that people in Canada actually have no moral standing to criticize what's happening in China today because of Canada's past and present. And I totally disagree with that view. I think actually people in Canada have a special responsibility to say what happened in Canada was wrong. The harm is still with us. The consequences are still with us. The costs are very high. Don't do it again. Don't model residential schools in Xinjiang on the terrible past in Canada. So I'll end that part of my remarks, and let me now move to some logistical issues. So we have a hybrid event here. I'm going to be asking our panelists, our authors, who I will introduce very shortly, some questions for about 30, 35 minutes, and then we will turn to a Q&A with all of you here in the room and on the Zoom. I'll just alternate between in room and on Zoom. We've got 47 people in each space, pretty much, maybe not exactly 47 here, but 40 some and 40 some. So we'll just alternate. And then the Q&A is the way you're going to ask questions in the Zoom. And the chat is not going to work for questions. I might not get to all the questions, so I apologize in advance for that. I do need to say this event is being live streamed and it is being recorded, so be aware of that. And at the end, we're going to have a chance to buy some of these books and to do some signing of the books. So let me introduce our speakers. Joanna Chiu is a senior journalist with the Toronto Star, which is Canada's largest newspaper. And she previously served as the bureau chief of the Star Vancouver. And she is the author of China Unbound, A New World Disorder, just now published. I've read it twice, and I urge you to read it, and we're going to hear a lot about it in just a couple of minutes. Professor Darren Byler is my colleague. He's an assistant professor of international studies here at Simon Fraser University. He's got another book coming out called Terror Capitalism, Uyghur Dispossession and Masculinity in a Chinese City. But we're here tonight to discuss this book, In the Camps, China's High-Tech Penal Colony. I've read this book twice, and it is painful. Joanna's book is painful too, but you can't stop reading either one. I'm here, my role here, I'm the moderator. I'm a historian. I work on modern China. I brought my own new book to show off. This is my book. It's called June 4th, The Tiananmen Protests and Beijing Massacre of 1989. I've talked about this one enough. I don't want to talk about it now, but I want to mention it just to say who I am and why I'm here. I'm somebody who's obsessed with sensitive topics as a historian. And our authors that we're talking with are also really fascinated by sensitive topics. The sensitive topic that I wrote about in this book used to be the most sensitive topic, but it's not anymore. I don't think it is anymore. I think what we're talking about now in these two books are actually more sensitive, and that's something that we can reflect on a bit. So we have decided that Joanna's going to answer the first question first, and then Darren will follow. But the first question that I have for our authors is simply, why did you write this book, and why did you write it in the way that you wrote it? So over to you, Joanna.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, for this great introduction and all you did behind the scenes with SFU to organize this event. You know, we are in a Twitter group together, and just constantly Jeremy's like talking about the logistics of this, and it is kind of a new thing we're doing. He's, you know, at this stage of COVID, in-person / virtual hybrid event. So thank you for coming today, and thank you for those who are joining through Zoom, which is, you know, more respected people on Zoom, because I myself, I've been on back-to-back calls. I've been waking up before dawn so during the last few weeks launching the book, because I'm trying to speak with people in different time zones. So why I wrote the book? Oh, you have a thing.
Put that on your bell. The people in Zoom are saying they can't hear you quite loud enough.
Great. We're experimenting with this format. Is it better? Hope it's better. So why I wrote the book, maybe firstly why I went to China, even though I was lucky to be Canadian, to grow up in Canada. I was born in Hong Kong as a colonial citizen, talking about colonialism and its impacts. Hong Kong was a British colony, and I was a British colonial subject. I got a British, Hong Kong passport, when I was born. And so, but Hong Kong was in this strange kind of like weird zone where some people were actually dreading the return to Chinese rule from British colonial rule, especially after the 1989 June 4th Tiananmen massacre. And that's why my parents, like many, many families, thousands of families, decided to leave Hong Kong in those years, in the early 90s. And that's how I ended up in Canada. But even though I grew up in Canada, as I grew up and realized that June 4th happened, that there was a one-child policy in China, and as a young woman, I found that also very sobering, because if I were a second-born daughter in China, my life would be so different. So I was just compelled to understand China and all the most sensitive parts, because the most sensitive political shakeups in China was what shaped my family's lives. Not just my generation, but my generations before me, who lived through the Cultural Revolution, who lived through Western imperialism in China. And my great-great-grandfather actually came to BC because he was tricked by Chinese officials that he could find gold here but instead had to work on the CP railway, in really harsh conditions, and ended up having to go back to China with little to show for all his toil in BC. So any Chinese person's family is like this. Like there's all of these issues, and they're all sensitive. Like no one with any connection to China doesn't have a personal connection to all of these sensitive topics that we write about. So I studied Chinese history at UBC, and I went to journalism school, and I wanted to go to China to understand on the ground, like all of these fascinating things that were happening. And like many people were optimistic at the time. My kind of tenure in China, 7 years, coincided with Xi Jinping, the current president, taking power. At first, people thought he might be a reformer because his background was pretty progressive. But instead, I had a front row seat basically as the crackdowns on civil rights that I was already aware of, in the 90s, 2000s, got worse under Xi. It seemed like month after month, there was some sort of new law or regulation that was just baffling. Right now, you may have heard that people under 18 in China can't internet game most of the week, except for Friday evenings. So that's just one example of some things that I would cover constantly, like new laws, new regulations affecting Chinese people's lives. And when I returned to Canada in late 2018, I felt maybe the China story was behind me to leave for journalists there to tell. Instead, in December, Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei CFO, she was arrested in Vancouver International Airport. That was enough of a big story to show that a China story is global. But a little over a week after that, the two Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, were detained as hostages. And now it's really, really clear that they were hostages and political pawns. Like, I don't think there's any doubt there. There wasn't much doubt then. But Kovrig is actually a personal friend of mine. Like, we were hanging out in better times in Beijing, where there was, despite, the internet not working, having to use VPNs, covering really dark political topics. At night, we could still go to the bars. Like, we could go to the, check out artist colonies, and see kind of the way that Chinese people were still trying to push the boundaries of what was permissible. But for him to have spent over 1,000 days in prison along with Michael Spavor, it just brought home that the Chinese authoritarianism, policing, is no longer something that you can really distance yourself from by leaving, or by not being Chinese. Foreigners are part of this story. And as I opened my eyes more, as working as an editor and a journalist at the Toronto Star newspaper's office here, there were just so many China-related stories just in Vancouver alone. I'm sure many of you know about them, but we felt like we were just constantly uncovering things. Things like the Port Coquitlam mayor telling us exclusively that dozens of his constituents were visited or received calls, but some were actually got physical visits from Chinese officials warning them in 2019 not to speak up in support of the Hong Kong protest movements, otherwise something bad will happen to them. And these people in Port Coquitlam, small city in Metro Vancouver, less than 60,000 people, were so scared. And they didn't even want to go to police. They weren't sure what to do, but they wanted to get the word out. So they did talk to their mayor that they trusted to at least say, as a group, this happened to us. If it's happening in this small suburb of Vancouver, we think it's happening everywhere. And indeed, it is happening everywhere. In classrooms like this at McMaster University, the Chinese embassy there in Ontario instructed students to monitor film and report back on a Uyghur Canadian's report on what was happening in Xinjiang. So that was one example coming from Canada of direct Chinese state involvement in trying to intimidate the conduct of free speech on Canadian soil. So I wrote China Unbound to explore all of these issues and also explore why Western societies and countries are complicit in what we see happening. In fact, Chinese officials coming to intimidate people, it's not a new thing. It's been happening for decades. My parents were talking about it when I was a child in the 80s and 90s here. But for some reason, I argue that it really took the two Michaels cases to really wake people up around the world to wonder, like, is this going to impact me? Am I going to be affected? My kid is studying English, studying Chinese in Beijing. Is he safe? Those questions came up after the two Michaels. And I argue that it was quite belated because similar things have been happening. Still now, many Canadians of Asian descent are basically political prisoners in China. Hussein Salil, a Uyghur Canadian, he has been in detention in China since 2006. And he's not a household name. There hasn't been the same outpouring of outrage and shock and people identifying with him like they identified with these two Michaels. So I think launching this book and the conversations I've had with people about what's wrong, a lot of people pinpoint the racism and xenophobia in Western societies as an underpinning for why Western governments perhaps were arrogant and did not prepare and think and equip themselves with China knowledge to kind of craft smarter, more robust policies towards China. And it's told in almost like a travelogue format because I wanted everyone to want to read it because these are heavy topics, but I wrote in a narrative nonfiction way, like eyewitness reportage in different countries. In 2019, I went to Europe, Australia, around North America to look for testimonies, like in-person stories. We'll talk about that later. But also myself, so the reader can kind of look at things through my eyes as I try to figure out these questions in different countries. So we're not only looking at these issues for a Canadian perspective or an American perspective, but through Italian, Greek, Turkish, Australian. I think those cross-country perspectives can give us a more nuanced and layered look at China and why global relations are in a state of disorder today.
Wait, let's see if Darren can take that off and put it right up into your mouth.
Okay, I'll give it a try. Thank you all for being here. It's really great to share the stage with you two. And it's an honor to see all of you in person and online. So the story of this book for me really starts, I guess, in 2003, which is when I went to the Uyghur region for the first time as an undergraduate student. I was studying photography and was really struck by this space that I didn't know before going there existed, really. It's this immense region, the size of Alaska, a lot of mountains and desert. It's on the Silk Road. And so there's a sort of, a kind of exotic feeling to the space. For me, as a white American kid from Ohio, going there. And so initially it was just like kind of the strangeness and the intensity of life in the streets that really drew my attention. But then, I went back to the US and went to college. I was in college already and started studying Chinese, studying history of this region, and sort of developed a longer term fascination with it. Went back a number of other times and started to build a network of friends in the area. And it was really those friendships that kept me at it because it's not easy to travel there. It's not easy to learn Uyghur, which is a Turkic language that's totally different from Chinese. Of course, not easy to learn Chinese. So it was years and years of studying Chinese just to get to sort of working capacity. And then I actually went and did fieldwork there in 2011 for a year, and then in 2014 and 15. And I had been trained as an anthropologist, so I was really hanging out with people. My daily activities were, waking up in the morning, going down to the tea shop, meeting my friends, and then talking about life. We read books together. We translated books together. These were young men that had come to the city to try to find work, but couldn't find work. They were unemployed or underemployed. Sometimes, they would find a short-term job, but it always seemed temporary. And they were always being sort of pushed around by the police or by the state authorities. And so the focus of my ethnography, which is the ethnographic book that I've written called Terror Capitalism, really centers around their stories. And already back in 2014 and 15, the state had declared that people's war on terror in response to several violent incidents that Uyghurs had carried out in the Uyghur region and in other parts of China. One of them happened in a train station called Kunming, in a city called Kunming, where over 30 people were killed. And that event was called China's 9/11. Very quickly in response to that, because it was a sort of nationwide event with, happening in front of everybody's smartphones. And so the state really couldn't control the narrative around this violence. And so they began the People's War on Terror that really began to, look for criminals that had carried out those actions, but to extend much farther beyond that to everyone who was doing things related to religious activity or to sort of Uyghur history and Uyghur culture, things that were slightly outside of the apparatus of the state. So I saw my friends start to be targeted by these systems. Initially, it was just that they were being sent back to their villages. And then some people would talk about how a community leader in their village had been detained and sent to a kind of camp. But they didn't think that, eventually they would all end up in camps. That's something that unfolded over quite a period of time. And so initially it was, just these young men, being very concerned, worried about their future, and really sort of building these really tight networks with each other to protect each other. Not really in any serious way because they didn't have any forms of protection, but they relied on each other to keep each other moving, to find a reason to live. Really, there's a lot of depression in the community, and talk of suicide and things like that. So, I began to understand that this is really a colonial situation, that there's a process of dispossession that has been put in motion over the previous 2 decades, and that the institutions, the schooling system, the banking system, those things had been captured by the colonial state and was systematically barring Uyghurs from finding the kinds of success that other migrants and settlers in the region, people from other parts of China, were able to access. And these things had produced pretty immense harms and dislocation. And the People's War on Terror was sort of laid on top of that. Then in 2017, people started to their WeChat accounts, which is how we would usually communicate, started to be deleted. I started to hear stories from friends, Uyghur friends in diaspora, that their family members and friends were being taken to these camps. And so then, over time, we began to realize that, oh, this is really a mass campaign to take people away. And so it, took us some time to figure out exactly what its effects are. I went back to the region in 2018 for a short trip to sort of see the neighborhoods where I'd lived before, and observe the checkpoints that had been built, the ways that people's phones were scanned and their faces were scanned, and really to look at the technology that was being used to assess people and their digital history. And this book really focuses on the way that technology has been used as a diagnostic tool to score people, to give them a reading of trustworthy, normal, or untrustworthy, and take away the untrustworthy population, people that are guilty of what they call terrorism crimes that are not serious. So, there was a mass evaluation of the population and people were taken away. I went and observed, but I had some conversations with people, but not like in depth because there's a lot of surveillance. So it's the sort of thing where you can have a quick conversation with a shopkeeper or someone in a taxi about, their relatives or family. Are they okay? Do they know about the camps? Everyone knew about it. Everyone was talking about the lagers, which is the German word for concentration camp, and is what's used among Uyghurs to talk about camps. It was widespread, but how do you actually get a sense of what that is and show it the truth value of all of those things? And it took some time to get access to internal police documents, but over time we got those documents, 52 gigabytes of them. They were obtained by The Intercept and then shared with me over the last couple of years. And I also then went to Kazakhstan and interviewed around 40 people that had been detained or were family members of people that had been detained and who had just fled across the border. And their stories really became the driver of the book. Because I want it to be accessible, I want to really focus on the sort of everydayness of what it's like to live in this system, and then, make relatively small truth claims about what is actually happening, in a way that builds up to something much larger, because it's a pretty dramatic dystopian story, but I didn't want to start with that. I wanted to start in the everyday, living in spite and through this kind of control.
I think I'll use this and you can use the lapel there. And thanks for that great start. What I really like about reading both of these books is the personal stories and the way that you as the author are there with the person who you're talking to. Darren's an anthropologist, but this is not really an academic book. There's no there's no real academic baggage here. It's an extremely accessible journey through these personal stories. Joanna's book is also an extremely accessible journey through personal stories. So, but from a journalist narrative nonfiction style. So the question I wanted to ask you next, and this will go to Joanna first, is if you could share with us the story of one interviewee, one person who you talked to, whose story had the biggest impact on the way that your book took shape.
I'll actually use that so I don't have to talk as loudly in the group. Okay, we can switch. You have a better voice as a professor, so I'm a writer, so I just sit and write, and all this talking is. Okay, so thank you so much, Darren, for being here really, and agreeing to do a double book launch, because just listening to your work and your background, and I have so much respect for that, and that you learned Chinese and Uyghur. I already had a background in Cantonese as a Cantonese speaker, so learning Mandarin was difficult, but not incredibly difficult. And it was already like the most difficult part of doing our work, I think, just the language alone. So thank you for your work. And I did go to Turkey and I interviewed several, like half dozen Uyghurs living in exile in Istanbul, because they felt that in Istanbul, in Turkey, there had already been generations of Uyghurs who had left Xinjiang and who had set up almost like expat sort of communities there, or, that they plan to stay there. And it was really, it was gutting for me just to listen to some of their stories. And when I was in Beijing, I did not have your guts. Like I left the Xinjiang story to my colleagues partly because it was just so wrenching and depressing. And also because I was worried about getting sources in danger if I were to travel from Beijing to Xinjiang at the time. I guess you started traveling there before, the crackdowns and the camps. But once I was in Beijing, pretty quickly they were in place. So I'll leave the Uyghur story to you. You're the expert. I just kind of tried my hand in one of my chapters at capturing some of, this human story behind it. But I'll start with a story of a Hong Kong Catholic school principal, high school principal. He used to teach, what would be the equivalent of our social studies courses in BC. And that course became like the target of Hong Kong Chinese authorities, liberal studies, as a reason so many thousands of Hong Kong youth rose up and, decided to make trouble and protest and clog up the streets and set up tents during Occupy Central, calling for democracy. Teachers were one of the main people blamed for poisoning the minds of the youth of Hong Kong. And definitely this source of mine, which I called F, just for his initial, he was a target, even though he was not a public figure. He taught liberal studies, this course that supposedly, because it was about politics and society, poisoned the minds of the youth, but also he was a high school principal, which, I guess authorities thought he had more power over the young people in that position. So he did support what the students were doing, what the protesters were doing in Hong Kong. Many, surveys showed that most of society in Hong Kong supported the aims of democracy, if not being divided over protest methods, because some protesters did eventually confront police and did not apply for permits to march peacefully, through makeshift weapons back at the police. That was what kind of people were divided by. But when it came to their aims, which was more democracy, more freedoms, trying to protect civil rights in Hong Kong, that enjoyed a lot of wide support, including from this principal. So he was running a marathon one weekend in Hong Kong after some of the protests had died down. And he just kind of took a bib that said D789, which was a slang form, was basically cussing out the leader of the city. And, you know, he wasn't sure what it was. He kind of took it and smiled for the camera. But the student who took this picture, you know, had quite a social media following. So that's when this high school principal became a target. And for a year, he received phone calls from these men speaking in low voices saying, "We know what you did. You're going to face trouble. We want you to quit your job." They wanted him to quit. That didn't work because actually he knew he was one of, you know, quite a few teachers and principals who were getting this treatment, getting these strange phone calls. So they went further. This group or whoever was targeting him, they wrote fake letters to the education ministry saying that he slept with students. That didn't get a response because the education bureau knew that likely it was politically motivated, that there were these false rumors, and they investigated and he hadn't. But they somehow got into an alumni group for the school and then spread the rumors. This school principal, he slept with students. He should be fired. So that's when he got, you know, stares every time he went into school. You know, when parents would look at him, he would be ashamed and wonder if that's why they gave him a funny look. And he became depressed. And he kept receiving those calls, those kind of menacing calls from these men. So he actually fled Hong Kong. He's now a refugee. I met him in Toronto. I heard his story sitting on a Starbucks patio in Toronto. So he was actually one of the first interviewees I did in early 2019 after I got this book assignment. And it kind of informed the way I told the book because I wanted to make these stories as human and as compelling as possible. And because, you know, any criticism of China, you know, it can be so easily taken down like, oh, how do we know it's true? These are anonymous stories. So it also informed my methodology of trying to assemble as much evidence as I could. So the people who I really like spotlight in each chapter are people who provided me with screenshots of things that happened to them, with audio recordings. For F, his case was more straightforward because he was able to get asylum, refugee status. So Canadian, refugee officials vetted his story as true and gave him refuge here in Canada. And also his story, I also want to use individual stories to tell a larger picture. So his story I used to tell the larger story of what the United Front was. Like, how many of you have heard of United Front? Yeah, I mean, even if you've heard of it, it almost sounds to many people like something from a spy novel, like foreign, like espionage and influence. Like, what does foreign influence mean? Like, if I go to, you know, the US and they talk about how great Canada is that foreign influence? Like, you know, Justin Bieber. But I don't know why I brought up Justin Bieber. I really like Bieber, so top of my head. So the United Front is actually a real department of the CCP. It's staffed, some researchers say, thousands of people. And Xi Jinping has recently presided over an expansion and improvement of this bureau and said that all Chinese Communist Party, you know, officials should really do United Front work. And United Front work is trying to gain loyalty and support for the CCP's goals, both within China and outside China. And Hong Kong is a case study for exactly these methodologies and tactics and how they became honed and refined over the decades, because Hong Kong used to be a British colony. So it used to be a foreign land. And Beijing had to use some of these more subtle methods to try to gain influence and control in Hong Kong before they officially took it over. So things that happened to F sound so similar to the stories I collected of things that happened to Canadians, to Americans, to Australians, but they happened in Hong Kong first in many cases because it was kind of a testing ground for United Front methods. So that's how I made kind of like the individual story wider by in each case kind of weaving people's testimonies with the historical context and analysis and the evidence that journalists and researchers have been able to collect to give insights, primary sources on how these kind of nefarious sounding activities from Beijing actually work and play out.
So the question is, what story do I really sticks with me?
Share with us one story.
Yes. Okay, so there's lots of stories to tell, and it's hard to choose one, but I think I'll just tell the story of Vera Joe, who is a Hui undergraduate student at the University of Washington, about 3 hours from here. She, came to the United States when she was 13 years old, and with her mom, they lived in Portland, or a suburb of Portland, kind of cul-de-sac. And she went to high school there. And then she went to the University of Washington to do her undergraduate degree, and she was studying geography. But before she came to the US, she had gone to elementary school and part of middle school in Xinjiang, which is where she's from. And her classmate from elementary school was still her sweetheart. Like they had really stayed in touch, because she had been going back to Xinjiang for the summers to see her dad. And so she wanted to go see him because she hadn't seen him for a while. So on a long weekend in the middle of the 2017 school year, she didn't even tell her mom and just got on the plane in Seattle and flew to Xinjiang. And it seemed fine. Like she spent, it was like 4 or 5 days. And I guess she just like skipped out of classes a bit too. But then things went sideways. So she went to the big city with her boyfriend to see a movie, Urumqi, which is the capital. And as they were leaving, her boyfriend got a call on his phone, and it was the police in Urumqi that said, "You need to come to the station. We have some questions for you." And it's like, okay, fine. Her boyfriend was Han, and Vera is Hui, but her dad is Han, and she's not religious at all. It just says Hui, which is Chinese Muslim, on her ID card. So they weren't concerned. Like, Vera was planning to move back to China and work in China after she graduated from UW. She thought China was fine. It's like where her future lay. Well, when they went to the police station, the police officer came out to the car and said, "Is Vera Joe," which isn't quite her real name, in the car? She asked me to use Vera instead of her Chinese name. And they said, "We also have some questions for her." And so they took her out. And then it turned out that they said, "The police from your hometown, which is 3 hours away, are coming to visit. And so you need to stay here until they get here. You're not under arrest or anything, but you just have to stay here." And so they waited for a couple hours, and it was getting late, but they weren't really allowed to leave, and so they didn't. And then the police came and they said, "Well, we have to take you back to your hometown." And so the boyfriend said, "Can I ride in the car with her?" And they're like, "No, she has to go with us by herself, and then you can follow in your car." And so they put her in this sort of paddy wagon kind of van, mianbao che. It's a van, and they put her in the back seat. And as they were putting her in the back seat, they said, "We actually have to handcuff you, put your hands behind your back and handcuff you." And that's when she realized that she is being arrested and that things are really going sideways. And when I talked to her, after she was finally released many years later about it, she said, "I thought I was in like a bad movie and that I could just wake up, or a bad dream or something, and I would wake up and realize this isn't true." And she said, this when she really started to scream and cry and said, like, "How can you do this to people that haven't done anything wrong? Isn't this a just country? Doesn't the law protect people like me?" And they just ignored her. And then eventually they said, "It's better for you if you shut up." And there's a young man about the same age as her, a Han guy, who was in charge of watching her in the back seat. And he just stared at her like she was a criminal the whole time. And so she started to like look out the window and was sobbing, watching the like landscape. And it was like steaming up the window. And then the boy, the young man, just like her age, reached over and like cleared the window for her because she couldn't do it because her hands were tied behind her back. And she said, that was a moment when I realized, oh, these people actually do have some humanity left, even as they're criminalizing someone like me. So she was taken to a camp, spent about 4 months in that camp. It wasn't as horrific as some, like the food was actually pretty good, but they weren't permitted to do normal activities inside the cell. There was about 20 people in the cell.
Let me interrupt you and ask you to tell us why she was detained.
She was detained because she had used a VPN to access her Gmail account and to upload her homework to Canvas, because you have to use you have to get on the server to do that. So she had used a VPN, didn't realize it was against the law for a Muslim to do that, and that's why she was detained. So there's a lot of political education in the camp, but mostly it's just sitting on stools, staring at distance learning, like a TV like that one. Although that one's probably nicer, where you have like Xi Jinping speeches, and then at some points of the day there's also music that plays. They're supposed to sing before they eat. They had a Shenghuo Lao Shi, which is a life teacher who was in charge of each person, and they organized them like it's a classroom. And Vera, because she spoke perfect Chinese, was made the Banzheng, which is the class monitor. And she was supposed to report on the others in her cell, who are everyone was Muslim. Most of the others were Kazakh or Uyghur. And they were supposed to write thought reports every week, confessing their crime. And she had been told it was the VPN, so she's talking about the VPN a lot. But she also told the others in the cell the stories she had heard in high school about Anne Frank, and like the Holocaust and stuff, like things that she remembered from the past, and was saying, this that's happening to us is similar to that, where we're being detained arbitrarily without any criminal trial, without any process. And it's kind of an interesting, thing to think about, is that a mass internment that happens after many other mass internments that everyone knows about has a different effect on the people that are being detained. So, I told her story in the book because I wanted to show that this is happening to regular people. It could happen to almost any of us, to an international student who's just trying to get by and goes back to her home and does something wrong. And really because of her Islamic identity. And throughout the book, I'm talking also about how the global war on terror has produced these kinds of Islamophobic stereotypes of people, places them in a category of suspicion without them having to do anything at all. Another part of the book that I'm trying to show through her story is that Seattle is not only a site where people can come from and be detained, it's also implicated in the production of the technologies that surveil the people that have been detained, which is maybe something I'll get into a bit more in one of the other questions.
Sure, thank you for that. There's been a lot of anti-Asian racism in Vancouver, in North America during the pandemic. We've seen it. A number of us in the history department have taken training courses to actively intervene when we do see it. But one thing that's striking in your books is that we also see Han Chinese in China behaving in a racist way to other ethnicities in China. And that was quite shocking to me in some of the examples in both of your books. In Darren's book, we see Han neighbors living in the same apartment block as Uyghurs. And when Uyghurs are taken away in the middle of the night to go to the camps, their Han neighbors are cheering and jeering at them. Like, good, they say. So that was quite shocking to me to read. And another example that you give in the book is a group of Han children on a bus taunting Muslims and saying, why haven't you been taken away yet? Shocking examples. I remember being shocked myself in 2019. I stay connected with a lot of former students from China on WeChat, and all of their moments blew up in mid 2019 during the Hong Kong protests. And it seemed like there was this performative moment where people felt obligated to say ethnically intolerant things about Hong Kong protesters and call for them to be killed and crushed. So my former students were doing this. It was quite shocking for me to see that. So, and Joanna writes a bit about this in your Hong Kong chapter. So I wanted to ask both of you to reflect on this question of Han racism, racist or intolerant behavior by Han people. How important is that to the stories that you're telling? How do you explain that? Who wants to go first on this one?
I will be quicker. To add on to that, I don't think it's just individual Han Chinese people. Definitely, I know exactly what you're referring to. And it's something that not just Han Chinese, which basically people who look like me, are guilty of in China, but also in diaspora communities. There's a lot of infighting and in group discrimination. So my family's from Hong Kong. A lot of Hong Kongers here in Canada who have, maybe been here 20, 30 years, look down on and are very, some of them, I don't want to, completely generalize, are not welcoming to more recent immigrants from mainland China. It's, people would say things like, don't sit on the floor, you're like a dirty mainlander. Mainlanders sit on the floor, like, people in my parents' generation. It's not like they don't think it's even a racist thing to say. They don't admit it's racism. It's just almost like a common sense, like to them, like that this ingrained sense of superiority and difference is so just normalized. And then you go into China and you realize that this kind of stuff happens between provinces. Beijingers look down on people in Hebei, or like people in Shanghai think they're the best, like, number one. Shanghai is pretty great, but like, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But I think more broadly, the state supports this kind of thinking, and it also supports the kind of idea that no matter where you are in the world, you are still Chinese. So people like me, if I'm in Canada, there's complicity in the West as well, because when I tell people that I'm Canadian, growing up, most people would not let me say that. Like, they wouldn't let me just say, I'm Canadian, I'm from Burnaby. They would just be like, no, honey, where are you really from? I'm like, I'm from Canada. And like, no, where are you from? Ancestors. Like, and I was like, okay, Hong Kong. And they're like, oh, it's so exotic. You're like from Hong Kong. Like, I've been there, like, sampans, like fishing people, like they go on and on. And this actually plays into what the Chinese Communist Party wants. It wants the loyalty of people all over the world, and it lays claim to the lives and the free speech of people of Chinese descent, even if they've been in the West for generations or elsewhere outside of China for generations. It also silences our voices, because so many of the people I spoke in the book say that, like, it's so amazing that you're even talking to me, because I've been warning about what's been happening for decades, trying to talk to local police, trying to talk to governments, and been ignored. It took 2 white men, 2 Canadians, 2 Michaels for suddenly our discourse has been shifting. Books like this are getting more attention. It wasn't the case. When I was in China from 2012 to 2018, many of my reports like barely made any impact. Like, we were kind of like speaking among like a bubble of China watchers and nerds. It's really in like the last few years, I feel like the general public is so interested. And that is really, really belated. And I think it does stem from racism, because it took Beijing targeting white people, to be honest, for many other people to be concerned and worried. But when they were targeting members of the Chinese diaspora, threatening them, threatening people like F, the high school principal, it doesn't become international news. It becomes almost like an inner community thing. Like, oh, it's too complicated. We don't want to get involved. We're worried about being called racist if we criticize the Chinese state. Basically, like, you deal with it yourselves, and not taking that responsibility as people with privilege and ability to at least, answer the question, like if I get a visit from a Chinese official, who do I turn to? If I go to police, will they help me? Like I've talked to the Ministry of Public Safety many times in the course of my reporting. They tell me that, just report to your local police. But I'm like, I tell them what police say to people, and they have no answer for me on what they're going to do to address this lack of basic structure to listen to people and protect people originally of Chinese heritage.
Yeah, so the question of racialization in China is an interesting one and a really important one. What I try to show in the book is the way that power is structured and systematized by state power, by institutions, by technology companies, which is really how you get at racialization as well, because racism is not only about individual acts of bias or prejudice, it's also about the way those biases and prejudices get institutionalized and begin to empower certain populations in certain ways. So in Vera's case, Vera Joe, after she was released after 4 months and was allowed back into sort of a neighborhood arrest situation, because she was Hui and could pass as Han, she would often go and she also had she was sort of a fashionista. So she had the clothes of sort of an urban person. And so she could go through the back gate of the checkpoints without checking her ID, and the guards would just kind of look the other way. So she could sort of pass as Han. But then the face recognition systems in the high traffic areas, like in mosques or buses or shopping malls, they would sometimes catch her face and know that she was on a watch list. And so then the police would come up and tap her on the shoulder and say, hey, you're out of your zone. You have to go back to your neighborhood. She stopped traveling outside of where she was permitted to be because if you get caught too many times, you can be detained again. So that's one way in which the automated systems actually read the people's faces, the phenotypes of their faces, the shapes of their eyes and nose to determine who's Uyghur, who's Kazakh, and who's Han. And they begin to work with the police to automate forms of response based on that. But it also works at the level of the ID, which your ethnicity is on your ID card, and that is if you're if you have a bad ethnicity, according to the sort of the hierarchy of the state, it means that you will be treated in a different way than other people, and so that's a way in which ethnic difference is racialized and begins to produce these differential outcomes for people. So, when Han people are saying racist stuff about Uyghurs, which is often the case in the Uyghur region, talking about Uyghurs being bad or being backward, as being dirty, as being dogs, or towel heads, all of these kinds of really, these slurs, that's them acting in racist ways, but it's coming from a state discourse that permits it, from a media discourse that amplifies Islamophobia, that the Muslims are taking over the country because they're eating halal food or wanting to eat halal food, those sorts of things. That Muslim men are dangerous kind of inherently because they're Muslim, that Islam is an ideology of hate. These are things that have come from the government. And regular people are hearing those messages and saying, oh, that's what the government is saying. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but we can say those things. And so it becomes a permitted way of talking. And then there's a comparative part to it too. Some of the people that went back and saw their families taking part in the system told me that they would compare what they were seeing in Xinjiang to what they were seeing on the TV about Black Lives Matter in the US. And they say, Uyghurs are much worse than Black people in the US. So what we're doing in China is necessary. We're justified in doing this, but also we can see that racism is everywhere. So we're not any different from anyone else. So there's a global discourse that feeds into this, and I think begins to normalize it in new ways.
Let me invite the audience on Zoom to start thinking about a question you might want to type in to the Q&A. I'll invite the audience here to think about a question you're going to ask. I'll ask one more question at this point before we go to Q&A. I have more than that, but I think in the interest of time, I'll ask you both to briefly answer this next question, which is sort of about, if you look at the title of your book or the topic of your book, readers are going to think this is a book that's critical of China. This is a book that's talking about problems. This is a book that's critical of the Chinese Communist Party practices today. And that is true. I've read these books both twice, and that is true. But what's really interesting and special about these books is what's equally true is you're very, to me, surprisingly critical of Western technology, of Western approaches that are leading to actually greater intolerance and repression in a kind of counterproductive way. We don't quite see that in the title of the book, but it's really there and really present. So I wanted to ask each of you, I guess we can start with Joanna on this one as well. How did you, and why did you adopt this stance of your critical gaze is focused in multiple directions in a really interesting way? Can you discuss that a bit for us?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for noticing that. I've had people comment on like links to my book saying like, oh, good, we need to read this because we need to figure out what Beijing's doing so we won't let them win. We need to beat them. Particularly in the US, it seems like this narrative that like, just this is a grand battle. And China's, doing all these things to try to take over and supersede the US as a world superpower is like really compelling to a lot of people. And to me, I feel like it doesn't, I've been so shocked really like coming back to Canada, back in the Western world, how simplistic many narratives on China are, and that there is these deliberate efforts at, bringing back a Red Scare, back in the McCarthyism. I spoke with someone who is an advisor for the Conservatives Party, and they're talking about emphasizing that, the CCP is communist because that makes them sound scarier, like communist China, communist regime. And in addition to that, I know like about nationalism in China, like living in China, looking at the internet there. But, I was more shocked returning, to the West when China becomes like such like a enemy and such like a object of fear and scorn that people deliberately conflate the Chinese people with the Chinese state. And with COVID-19, we've seen, President Trump call it the Kung flu, saying that all Chinese international students, basically they're spies. This struck me in the research for my book because it was completely, you can't miss it. It's really just in your face. It's when we think about solutions to and how to put effective pressure on China to change its human rights abuses, as someone, who could be subject to these abuses, I don't feel safer or more comforted by the Western discourse and responses. Like when someone's standing up and, conflating the Chinese people, putting suspicion on them, I don't think it's going to lead to better human rights conditions in Hong Kong or Xinjiang. I think it might make matters worse. And in some cases, particularly in the US in that chapter, I talk about how there's almost a wish among some quarters for war to take place, like as if they're beating the war drums. I spoke with people in the US military who joined, they said because they wanted to provide a more nuanced perspective on China to prevent war from taking place. But the fact that some people had, made career decisions because they were afraid of war with US and China means that it's unfortunate that they feel that it could be sparked from the American side. So that's why I'm critical of the West. And I think we all have to, because in a way, that's what we have the power to do. If that's one big part of the equation, it's easier in democracies for us to try to change policies here than to figure out how to change policies of the CCP. That's a place that seems so obvious to start from. Instead, the people who get platforms to talk about China are people like Newt Gingrich, like Trump, like Steve Bannon, and not experts, not people like Darren who learned Chinese, lived there, spent time actually knowing Chinese people. And they're not people of Chinese descent. People who spent their lives working on China aren't being treated as experts and being elevated to positions of power in the US, probably in Canada too. There's some issues with some Chinese experts not even getting into the door to work for the government because they're denied security clearance, especially if you are of Chinese heritage like me. Speaking with colleagues there, they say that they avoid going to China because they know if they spend time in China, they will be seen as compromised. And if they apply for a government job, they're going to be denied it. Applying for these jobs, people like Amy Chang, they've said online, they get asked, are you a Chinese spy? Or are you more loyal to China or to the US? These people who should be the ones crafting these solutions to these major problems are getting kicked out and they're being abused, really. And it's not just an American problem. In Canada, Theresa Tam, the head of our COVID response, a conservative MP asked her, are you loyal to China? Like, it happens in Canada. And the Conservative Party did not criticize him for doing so. That comment was left to stand, this really racist, xenophobic comment against someone who's trying to lead our COVID response. So definitely, if any of us have any power to change things, it is to figure out what our government's leaders are doing when it comes to China issues and, providing feedback on that.
Yeah, so for me, like critiquing the West is, what I spend a lot of my time doing. And in this book, I guess there's a couple objects of critique that are coming from the West. One is the global war on terror, the Islamophobia that's been spawned by that, and the way it's been taken up in China, both in terms of discourse of the Islamic threat, but also in terms of tactics, what kind of military and policing sort of science you should use. Counterinsurgency theory, which is mapping the entire population and sort of breaking the social networks and removing people from it, something that was first done in the Iraq War, in Iraq and also Afghanistan. And then also CVE programs, which are countering violent extremism programs that are trying to prevent people from being radicalized, which often conflate piety, religious practice with Islamic, with violent intent or politics, with a kind of political Islam, when there's actually there's no real evidence to show that those things should be correlated. It's really just coming out of an Islamophobic sort of fear. And both of those things have been taken up by the Chinese authorities. That's what they think that they're doing. They think they're doing counterinsurgency, and they also think they're doing CVE. They're just doing it better than Western countries have done it because they're doing it with Chinese characteristics, is what they say, which means that they're doing it at a different scale, and they're mobilizing sort of the entire society and grassroots workers. So the civil affairs ministry people are the ones that are tasked with evaluating everyone in their neighborhoods. And they've also hired 60,000 grid workers who man the checkpoints as low-level police. So there's kind of an army of people that are put in motion. That's one object of critique. The other object of critique is the technologies that are being used are emerging out of the mid-2015s, which is, or 2010s, which is when artificial intelligence breakthroughs really began to sort of come to the fore that would allow people to assess biometrics and also data in really new ways. And so a new sort of global industry, you could call surveillance capitalism, has emerged in the West. And probably all of you are aware of it, that like your phones are really tracking your behaviors. And it's telling Facebook or whatever apps you have on your phones what you're up to so that you can be advertised to more efficiently. That is being done everywhere in the world, but to different effects. So people that are not in protected positions as citizens are disproportionately harmed by those kinds of surveillance. And the Uyghurs are really at the limit of how those kinds of surveillance can be used to assess populations and decide who's untrustworthy. So they're using these tools to go back through people's digital history, things that they did 4 or 5 years ago, and decide, oh, this person was interested in the Quran back then. He must, be interested in becoming radicalized, and so we should detain him. That's the system that's enacted, but it's really built in the West and just now been sort of amplified and reformatted for new uses. But some of those partnerships, are actually still in place. Many of them have now been severed. But it was all the way up until 2018 and 19, which is what I'm writing about in the book, when Microsoft was working with a company called Mugvi, which is based in Seattle, one of the branches. And when I went to Xinjiang in 2018, I saw the Mugvi face scan machines at the hotel that were there to track me and decide who should register in that hotel.
You asked the clerk if you needed to scan your face, right?
Yeah, and he said no, because I'm a foreigner. It's just for the local people. So anyway, these are global connections, and so it's important to show that.
Great. I have the power to turn on these really special microphones above your heads there so that we can hear the audience when you ask your questions. So let's turn to those of you in the room here first. Who wants to kick us off with a question for one or both of our panelists, if you're ready for one? I see two. Sir, you with the tie had a question first. Go ahead.
Thank you. In the UK, where I'm from, an academic and 5 members of parliament were sanctioned by the Chinese state for speaking out. One of those men was the former leader of the opposition in the UK parliament, and he said that he would not be silenced and he would wear the sanction as a badge of honour. So my question for you both is, do you expect repercussions in a similar fashion because of your work that you've carried out?
Do you expect repercussions? You haven't been formally sanctioned in the way that the UK can do by. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, that's a disquieting thing that all people who work in this field have to face. There's hundreds of thousands of people working on this topics, and the difficult thing is that I think all of us feel some fear of different fears, like maybe the least urgent, maybe the least dangerous one is fear of losing access, which is actually a fear because that means your whole life's work is compromised. Fear of not being able to do anthropological work in China anymore or other work in China because merely because you're a foreign academic. Sometimes what happens is that it doesn't matter really what you do or what you write or what you produce. It's like your affiliations. So your university, maybe it hosted the Dalai Lama, that puts a mark on you. Or your newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, for example, being banned or being, your journal is getting kicked out of China because Beijing was unhappy about an op-ed. I think it was called the Ugly, what was it, Ugly Man? I forget, but they said it was racist about China. And it was an op-ed that was written in New York, not by any of the journalists in China, but the journalists were kicked out. So there's no rhyme or reason to who gets targeted, who faces repercussions, who loses access, and who gets worse. Michael Kovrig, Michael Staver, I don't think neither of them would have guessed that they would have spent 1,000 days in jail. Kovrig was a diplomat, and diplomats, enjoy immunity, and he was a diplomat on leave. Michael Staver, he wasn't even focused on China. His focus was on Korea. So he didn't even do any work related to China. He happened to live there. So because it's so random, at least, not that I take comfort in it, but because it's so random, it's hard to even think about or predict. And personally, I continue this work partly because of the great community that's around it, because of how intense our work is. I think communities you become instant friends, and the support is so great within people who work in these fields. So I think that's what keeps me going personally.
So, around I don't know, 24 of my friends, people I know, were detained and were imprisoned in 2017 and 2018. And you know, I think often about what their daily life is like, and you know, how they've been silenced. Some of these people are the, you know, the brightest lights in Uyghur society that were taken away. And so I feel an obligation to them to speak, and you know, any sort of sanction that I might receive is a very small sacrifice relative to theirs. And I also think a lot about my friends in the Uyghur diaspora. Many of them are here in Vancouver, whose family members have been detained or could be detained if they speak out. And because I'm a protected citizen, I can speak, and they can speak through me in some ways. I can amplify their voices. And so that's what I speak out of. And I don't know if it'll get much worse or not. I mean, the Global Times has already told the entire nation and the world that I'm an anti-China figure and that I secretly work for the US intelligence agency. It's not true. I don't work for the US government in any way, would not. So, you know, they've said that already, which makes me feel as though it wouldn't be a smart move for me to go to China anyway. But, you know, yeah, if they sanction me, I mean, that's up to them.
Yeah, COVID kind of makes it a moot point since people who don't have Chinese passports, it's very difficult to go, and it's not really an option to go right now. One interesting repercussion that I have experienced after publishing this book is I supervise a lot of graduate students from China. Every year at this point in the year, I usually receive 5 to 10 inquiries about, would you be willing to supervise me? Would you encourage an application? And I co-supervise all my graduate students with a colleague at UBC. And we usually get the same amount. And now that this book is at the top of my web profile, I've gotten 0 inquiries this year, and he's gotten more than 6 or 7 already. So that's happened to me, and I'm a bit saddened by that. I'm not quite sure what to do about it. But why don't we go to you in the UBC library, Mask? Do you have a question for us?
Right around, right? You can really see. My question, I think, is more for Darren. It's about the people working as police. You mentioned the low-level police in Xinjiang. I traveled to Xinjiang in 2015 and then again in 2018. And luckily in 2018, I could speak more with the local people, well, obviously not very much, but the only people that I could really speak to was the local police that follow me around. So I discovered then that these group of people, I feel like it's also a lot of them are local Muslim people, and a lot of them are living like really controlled, restricted lives. And I just wondered what you know about them. Maybe did you have any sources from that group, and do you know any interesting scholarship about them? I've kind of been thinking about this for like since I traveled there. Like,
yeah. So yes, there's one chapter that's focused just on them, and another free article, if you don't want to buy the book, called The Data Police, the Xinjiang Data Police, which is about those kinds of people. They're called Xiejing, which is assistant police, and actually are police contractors, which means that they don't get like the benefits or the training of regular police. So they just have like a 2-week boot camp, and then they're like put on the job to like evaluate people and decide if they should be detained. And most of their work is in the surveillance hubs, the People's Convenience police stations, or at checkpoints where they stop and ask people for their IDs, or they could be assigned to follow someone like you. But yes, they are also kind of an oppressed group. I mean, they're mostly underemployed young Muslim men, and sometimes women, but mostly men, a lot of Uyghurs and Kazakhs. And like people signed up for those jobs as a way of protecting themselves often, and their family as well, from being detained, and not really understanding or knowing that they're going to be tasked with detaining, their own communities, people that they know, their own neighbors, and tasked with transferring them with bags over their heads, their hands shackled behind them, people that they know. So, yeah, it's a difficult position to be in. I call them the low-level functionaries in the system, who are, pressed into service and really can't leave, because if they quit the job, they can be detained, sent to the camp themselves. And they've seen what it looks like.
It's really easier for me to, it's really difficult for me to go back and forth because I'm seeing you in the room, your face. I don't see the faces of the people on Zoom, but I also want to give the Zoom questions a chance. Here's a question that I think Joanna can start with, and that is, China is hugely important for American and Canadian economies. Our economies are intertwined. In view of this, how do you think economic codependence between China and Canada, China and the US, might influence or even stifle Canadian and US responses to Chinese humor?
So I think that statement itself, I spoke with a very senior Canadian official recently, and that's almost word for word what he said, as an excuse to not do really the basics on foreign policy in Canada. The Trudeau team has been promising a reset of foreign policy in general in light of like arbitrary detention and hostage taking diplomacy. It's been years that hasn't come out. And basically what I hear from sources in Ottawa is that there is no plan to do a reset on foreign policy or to, announce anything different it would do in the Canada-China relationship in particular. And because the senior official told me, because Canada and once is enmeshed with China's, and there is a lot that China can do to hurt the Canadian economy. And there's already been some taste of that after Joanna Chiu was detained. Beijing banned stopped importing Canadian canola and pork products, and that really hit our farmers hard. Even though once those tariffs were lifted, the levels of trade between both countries returned to pre-tariff, pre-ban levels. So, with left to their devices, I think private individuals in Canada, China, and all over the world want to engage and interact. And sometimes these tariffs are less imposing than they seem because so far they've been temporary, and when they've been lifted, things have returned back to normal or better. But still, I think the fear of economic retaliation now is one of those top of mind for many leaders, and is being used as the main reason why there's no even like open discussion about how to change our foreign policy or to strengthen, I think, our basic safeguards with digital surveillance from foreign states. That's also something that many Canadian journalists have been asking our leaders about, and there's no plan on it. The latest I heard was there's a 5-year plan to maybe start working on a proposal. So I think this question of the economic backlash is really just undermining any kind of traction to even start working on these political issues, which personally I don't think that should be the case. I think at least some work should be done to explore and examine potential solutions.
Why don't we turn to, sorry, I saw you in the back.
Kind of taken on with that is just even taking it to the further point. It's not simply about the economic repercussions to us, but more, there are people that are trying to frame this in a binary new Cold War type of framework. Then to me, that potentially supposes that the end game is the collapse of China. So given our integration globally with many other countries with China, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that there's going to be significant economic repercussions around the world with the collapse of China in the vein of 2008, 1927? And if that's the case, is it really more in our interest to ensure then that we avoid that? And in the sort of lexicon of 2008, is China too big to fail? And kind of another just sort of kicker to that, if China does fail in this new Cold War, they have nuclear weapons. Who's going to be in control of that if they do?
It's a good question, and I think the binary discussion of us versus them, and also good and bad, which is not true at all, is not helpful. I was, via the miracle of Zoom, really recently in a conference in Malaysia, 2 days ago. And one of the things that someone was saying in that conference was, Malaysia is really within China's orbit in a much stronger way than we are here. And they were saying, really what we need China to do is to be the global leader that it wants to be, to model the behavior that other countries would want to emulate. And so we should really be pushing them in those directions rather than thinking about an adversary that is. And they were using sort of US kind of talking points in some ways, like with great great power comes great responsibility, and China should think about that. But I think there's some truths in that China wants to be a global leader and then needs to act in ways that meet international standards and protect human life, civil rights, all of those sorts of things. And so we should be pushing for that rather than for a sort of a collapse or something like you're suggesting.
I would also add to that I don't think we're at that point where there's no opportunities for engaging with Chinese officials. I think Chinese officials, in the course of the research on my book, both the historical context and now, they don't want to be isolated from the international community either. They also want respect. Like, I think the need for respect is actually pretty ingrained. And also, having worked with foreign ministry officials in Beijing, because they kind of assign different foreign ministry officials to be handlers for media. There is a very wide range of people, like we were talking about with police in Xinjiang. The people who are working as diplomats or in the ministry in China, they come from like a very diverse range of viewpoints. And I know that many are very upset and angry at the direction that China is going into, where they're not tolerating these more moderate voices to have any say. Things have changed really quickly, but those people still exist in Chinese politics. And China, for what it says and what it's seen in its State Council documents and demonstrates, is that it doesn't want to dismantle the international world order. It wants to amend the existing institutions to be more friendly to its view of how the world should work. For example, it said that the United Nations has no role to even talk about human rights in other countries. China wants all nations, regardless of regime type, whether they're dictatorship or democracy, to have equal standing, and they find it offensive that democracies, which don't even practice what they preach according to China, and has some resonance broadly, that they don't have a right to criticize what they're doing to their people. So, but in a way, like, I think that's not as bad as it could be. They're not saying like we're going to, as a new world leader, like put an end to the UN or the WTO. They are wanting to amend things, but they want to see at the table going back to critiques of the West, our weakness is that the lack of China knowledge in so many countries, and the lack of access that Chinese experts have in government positions, means that when we have these opportunities, when we have someone sitting next to Xi Jinping, we might might not use these opportunities very well.
I just want to echo the celebration of diversity within China is, I think, what the China collapse narrative misses. Because there are a lot of people in Xinjiang, Han people, who were behaving in racist ways or celebrating the detention of their neighbors, but there's a lot of Han people in Xinjiang who are offended and upset by what's happening, and they've leaked these documents, right? And when Xi Jinping decided to become leader for life in 2018, every person who I was in touch with, I landed in Hong Kong that day and was meeting with mainland friends that day, and Chinese Communist Party members, strong Han nationalists, were really upset and unhappy about Xi Jinping's direction and what he had done. So there's liberals in China, they have to be very quiet right now. There's dissidents in China, they have to be very quiet right now. There's a ton of diversity that I think we have to recognize when we're talking about that. I see. I think we have time for one last question, and we'll go to you.
Yeah, no, and And my question is, from how I see the change could happen is from within, as more and more folks inside China who are citizens of their country can shift their own perspectives, because in some sense, they're also complicit in supporting their government. So I'll give a personal example. My mother here practices Falun Gong, and that's been an ongoing issue for my family because the police comes to my grandma's home where my mom's hukou is, knocking on the door, intimidating. So my grandma, she's always, although she says she's pro-communist, she's always found ways to like knock off the police. She knows that, I think deep inside she knows my mom is doing something she's proud of. But on the surface, to me, she's like, let's be quiet. You know, why don't you just agree with the government? Like, I think she's really scared. And she's like, would it be better if China has a revolution? And to me, there's just this deep fear of questioning. And this is a phenomenon I see that's quite widespread. My grandma was only willing to tell me. I could just sense that deep fear from an 80-year-old who has been through so much in this country. So just really curious on your perspectives on how Chinese people could evolve from within.
I think that's really, really hard. Like, thank you for sharing your family story. A lot of people who are my sources in China, like, now are no longer speaking up at all. Like, you know, people used to find ways around censorship. Like, they would post images, they would use wordplay. It was like so creative. Peppa the Pig is like a symbol of rebellion in China for some reason. And then Peppa the Pig, Winnie the Pooh, all of these things get censored. And then all of these spaces, and I think what's interesting is like, there is like such a desire in China to talk about these things. When Clubhouse, that audio only app, was allowed to operate in China before it got too popular, it was like many, I don't know about you, but like many China experts in the West like spent so many nights up late listening on these conversations, because for the first time in a while, Chinese people were able to speak on very sensitive issues like Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, with people around the world in Chinese, in this like kind of almost like open space, because you couldn't see each other's faces, it was just voices. And it's still so vibrant. So that vibrancy is still there. That interest in learning about all of this is still in China. It's just a question of, are people just biding their time? And my sense is that people are hoping that things will change somehow, even though Xi Jinping has basically allowed himself to be emperor for life. I think there is some optimism still in Chinese friends that they could basically bide their time and hopefully things will get better soon. But I think us outside, we have a privilege of talking about these issues. A lot have expressed regret at leaving it to Chinese people to figure it out themselves. You know, Tim Cheek is a mutual friend of ours, and I interviewed him for the book. He's head of the Asia Institute in BBC. He says he regrets not being more outspoken earlier because he had left it to his really talented, insightful Chinese colleagues to do their work. But then one by one, they got silenced one way or another. So he felt that he could have done something. You know, people in the West could have done more earlier rather than leaving it to, you know, their Chinese counterparts to put it all on themselves.
It's a difficult question at the space of hope in China and where it is. I was going to talk about Clubhouse too. There was while it was allowed, there was a one room that was called "Are There Concentration Camps in Xinjiang?" in Chinese, and all of the people in the room were Chinese speakers, and it got really large, like 4,000, 5,000 people were in that room. It lasted almost 24 hours. There was people from Xinjiang, people from Beijing and Shanghai, people from around the world, talking about their own experiences, their own relationships with Xinjiang, the things they had seen themselves. And there was also Uyghurs in the room as well that were kind of leading the conversation, which was really important because it was a very civil conversation, and a lot of people cried. A lot of people were really afraid to say the things that they had seen in public for the first time and have it heard, but I think it was also cathartic for them. But there was one story that really stood out to me. It was that this one person who was from Beijing said that, you know, when they first heard about this, what was happening in Xinjiang, it was from the BBC, or a friend had shared a story with them from the BBC that compared it to concentration camps in Germany, or just called it concentration camps, and they said, oh, that can't be true. That must just be Western imperialism. It must be fake news from the West. And dismissed it. And like this person was sort of a nationalist, I think, at the time, and really thought that China was on the rise. But they said that they started to do their own research. I mean, they kept hearing about it, and then they started to do their own research, and they realized, oh, most of what we've heard is actually true. And you know, gradually came to the conclusion that, oh, there really are these camps. This is really happening. And they also thought, you know, I changed my mind, and I thought I never would. And that means that many other people can change their mind too. And I just thought that was a really moving story. It's only one story, so I can't say that it's happening everywhere. But I think people that, you know, are engaging with the broader world, mostly it's people with a bit more privilege and affluence that can do that. I think they're questioning, and I think the more we talk about it outside of China, I think, and do it in a compassionate, empathetic way, I think the more that we can begin to move people in China. That's my hope anyway.
Now is the time for me to thank and apologize to those of you who had questions, didn't get a chance to ask them yet, especially on the webinar. Lots of great questions. I'm really sorry I didn't get to voice all of those. But we need to move on to giving people a chance to buy some books right outside before the bookseller leaves. If you're online and you want a signed copy, you can go to irondogbooks.com or requests@irondogbooks.com, and they can indicate you want a signed copy. You can buy a signed copy even if you're not physically here tonight. So please join me in thanking our two authors. We're going to stick around for another 20-30 minutes for book signing.
Or outside for book signing.
I think we can just stay here.
Stay here.
Yeah, and we will say thank you to our Zoom audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for moderating and planning this event, and SFU for hosting. It's very high tech. Talking about tech. So thank you for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Can Asian studies be a major actually?
What did you think of the event?